All right, one, two. Got some more film movements. There's a lot to go through. Today we'll be doing 30s and 40s. I did a little bit of a spiel in the previous video about why I think film movements are notable and important and useful. Essentially, they serve as a little bit of cultural context, certainly a good amount of historical context. As we understand film, as we can understand some of the ways that it can influence people's lives and its progression as an art form. So I highly recommend going through some of these film movements for if you're interested in film at all for this context and perhaps even for some cultural appreciation in some cases. So we're going to kick off today with the documentary film movement. This is a British movement from the 30s, headed chiefly by John Grierson, who is an interesting early cinematic figure. He viewed cinema as something that could educate and further the public's interest in the direction of the country. He called the documentary a creative treatment of actuality. He wanted to use it to educate people, something like housing crisis, addressed, as you might guess, a housing issue in Britain. It's recognizable in form as a documentary film, like it has interviews, it has simple depictions of what it's talking about, and you can clearly see, like from the very beginnings, documentary was clearly stated, clearly helpful in its purpose. I'll link to an article that goes over that film and John Grierson a little bit in more detail. So you can read about that a little more if you want, because I know early documentaries are not necessarily what everyone is looking for. But these are shorter films. So if you happen to have time to go through some of these, certainly recommend it. I think they're worth your time, even if they're relatively simple. Grierson was not the only filmmaker. One of the other notable ones was Basil Wright, who made another early documentary film called The Song of Ceylon, which goes into a little bit of depth on the Sinhalese people and depicts them, some of their cultural customs, as well as the influence of modern communication technology on them. So I think between these two, especially the housing crisis and Song of Ceylon, you can see the early form of documentary, the social side, and just simply documenting something that is relevant to the country of Britain at the time. It's straightforward. It's pretty much what it sounds like. It's simple documentaries, but it's an important stepping stone. It's an important step in film history, realizing the educational and perhaps evocative benefits of depicting this creative treatment of actuality that John Grierson referred to. Next, we've got Poetic Realism, one of my favorite movements. This, strictly speaking, is less movement than stylistic tendency. There's not a particularly strong overarching connection between these directors and this style, but they are recognizable. They are kind of under the same umbrella, so we'll refer to them as a movement because they often are referred to as one movement. Poetic realism films tended to create a lyrical, kind of exaggerated version of reality under which relationships, struggles, moral issues were examined. These films do tend to focus on regular people, even though the trappings are somewhat extravagant, and the trappings of the stories are also a little less ordinary. These films also often featured moral ambiguity and a focus on interpersonal dynamics and relationships. The focus on moral ambiguity may sound a little bit familiar from film noir if you're familiar with the subgenre at all. Poetic realism was actually a sizable influence on noir. Not just the moral ambiguity, but also the visual style tended to be rather shadowy and moody in a lot of cases, similar, as you guessed it, to film noir. Film noir has a couple of major influences. Poetic realism is not the only one, but I think its stylistic influence is quite notable in some cases. And one of the examples of these films we'll go over, I think, is a great example of almost a crossover point between the two. Some notable directors are Marcel Carnet, again, apologies for French pronunciations, and Jean Renoir. Some notable works include Les Talents, The Grand Illusion, Port of Shadows, and Children of Paradise. My favorite, personally, is Carnet. Children of Paradise is on the short list of favorite movies, and I love Port of Shadows and Daybreak as well. His stuff is really excellent. Jean Renoir is probably the most well-known, and Jean Vigo is probably the first in this movement specifically, with Les Talents. So I will refer to Port of Shadows a little bit right here. which I think, as I said earlier, is a great demonstration of where film noir and poetic realism have their similarities. Port of Shadows has that clear, darker, shadowier style to it. Even interiors of shops, like there are scenes where characters are still shadowy. There's nighttime driving and fog. The characters, it's a crime story. Characters are runaways. They're desperately struggling to relate to each other. Exploration of love. Personally, for me, like this is I would consider Court of Shadows straight up to be a noir, even if technically the term doesn't exist yet. But though I picked Port of Shadows for a comparison point, not every one of these films is noir-ish. I mentioned Le Talent earlier, which might also be one of the most well-known films of the movement. It is unrelated to crime, kind of. It is, it's not a crime story. It is a relationship story. It's a marriage story. It focuses on these two people and it uses kind of the heightened style and the heightened sense of conflict, I think, in the film to kind of highlight the dynamics at play. I mentioned earlier, these are stylistic films, and they're also regular people. I think it can be tempting to think of a stylish film as kind of alienating you almost from characters, where the style becomes a greater focus than the people. But I think if you have a stylistic film that centers on people, in a sense, it can just, by hyperbole, highlight the dynamics at play. We have what is ultimately a story in Les Talents about two people struggling with responsibility, struggling with a sort of push and pull between people you love, struggling with responsibility and freedom, and the heightened sense of reality in that story, the sort of exaggerations exaggerate the thematic points and I think make them a little more meaningful. I think it's kind of fascinating, really, that as we'll get to in Italian neorealism, you can also have a heightened sense of the emotions and the themes at play by stripping everything down so far. Italian neorealism was kind of the bare minimum, very straight faced, very simple and honest in its depictions of real life, real people, real problems. A movie like Les Talents is heightened. It has more flair. But that doesn't take away from the honesty. And I think it's just fascinating, how artistically you can communicate strong emotions with the exact opposite kind of approach, either something completely stripped down or something heightened by style and the aesthetics of execution, I think. So, for Italian neorealism, we're talking about here one of the, at least for my money, probably second most impactful film movement. I don't know if you could truly rank these things, but I would put this in French New Wave. They're probably number one and number two. I think one of the reasons neorealism is so important is the way it demonstrates simplicity and the fact that you can make films this impactful, this lasting, by being as simple as, almost as simple as possible. This movement started out from a circle of film critics in Italy, Mussolini era Italy, who were frustrated with the current state of cinema in the country. Films went through Mussolini. There was a lot of government approved media. Even the newspaper that these critics wrote for often suffered censorship from Mussolini's son, who was the head of the paper. They felt that cinema was losing its place as belonging to the people. The films that were approved were generally glossy, Hollywood esque productions, and they felt the honesty was lost, and they felt that the people were not being represented by the country's films. So they sought out to change that. Now, of course, the difficulty was if you're not getting government approval, you can't get government funding, you can't do as many things, we'll say, certainly not technically, as some of the glossier, more high profile Italian films of the time were able to do. So they did what they could. They had limited equipment, they had limited resources, limited money. They went out onto the streets. They filmed, on location in Italy. They used a lot of non-professional actors. And here we are. 80 years later, this is still a lot of lauded movies from this era. And it's for good reason. There's something about simplicity and honesty in depicting real, empathetic human problems that is just always going to have a place. even if some of these issues that are being covered in some of these films are not the exact same issues that people today face. Generally, these are extremely empathetic films because general ideas like struggling with money, struggling with your place in society, struggling with the institutions that be, that's always going to happen. That's just part of the human condition. Some notable directors of this period include Roberto Rossellini, Vittorio De Sica, Luchino Visconti. Some notable works include Osessione, which is considered sometimes to be the first neorealist film, Germany Year Zero, and Bicycle Thieves. So many of these films are somewhat tragic, downbeat. Not every single one of them, but many of them, we'll say, because these critics at the time, these eventual directors, were not necessarily as ecstatic about the direction of the country necessarily. They highlighted the things they found to be important, often which were struggles of the people in the country. But not all of them were the exact same movie. Some of them, like something like Bitter Rice or Osessione, were, I'm probably not saying Osessione, right? Is it Osessione? I should have Googled that first. Have a more crime bent to them, but they are often fairly understated dramas. My personal favorite of the movement is Umberto D, which, as I describe it, you'll see the general simplicity and also empathy of it. Umberto D is about an elderly man and his dog who are essentially trying to live life in his old age. One of the strengths of the film, I think, is showing the way burdens placed on the people compound. And what I mean by that is you see people throughout the film who, due to their own personal obligations, they are suddenly unwilling to make things work for other people. We see people throughout who are concerned with their own well-being, essentially, and their own financial security. They're not willing to help our title character despite his obvious needs. And I think, given the context of how much he's struggling, we see some other people around him struggling as well. It certainly feels like it's depicting this society where people are just kind of being trained to look out for themselves because things are tough and there's not enough room to look out for other people as well. It highlights the plight of the disadvantaged. In some cases, it even shows a certain level of absurdity in the way people have to act under these conditions. And also, even if you don't take my recommendation, it's one of Ingmar Bergman's favorite films. So listen to him, watch this movie. It's really lovely, it's sad, and it's remarkable, really, what can be accomplished in film with so little. All right, next time I'll talk about the 50s, which will feature my favorite film movement, which probably no one likes more than me, odds are. But I'll try to sell it. I'm not optimistic I'll get many converts, but we'll give it a shot. So I'll see you in the next video.